Born in Wallsend, a mainly working class area of North Tyneside in the early 1950s, Gordon Sumner, aka Sting's drive for success and creativity, was established in the region of his birth, with vestiges of his northern Englishness continuing to re-emerge in his music long after he left the area. The process of exploring and sometimes exercising his background through songs such as All This Time and We Work the Black Seam is culminated in his most recent recording, The Last Ship. It's an album replete with local dialect and real and imagined characters based from his past, resulting in a vivid visual portrait of the time, places and spaces of his upbringing through the lens of his imagination and memory. This paper will investigate Sting's often problematic love-hate relationship with his hometown of Newcastle since forming the Police in 1977, with a particular focus on an analysis of the song Dead Man's Boots from The Last Ship. After performing one of their final gigs in the northeast of England at Newcastle University Theatre, Sting said his final farewells to his band, Last Exit, in January 1977, setting off for London with his wife and baby son Joe, and according to Sting, a couple of bags of clothes, 2 guitars and a wicker rocking chair, what he described as his worldly belongings. Their financial future was at that point unknown, but this decision to leave his security as a provincial school teacher and part-time musician was pivotal, not only in terms of his forthcoming projection into megastardom, but also for guaranteeing that songs such as The Bed's Too Big Without You and I Burn For You were not condemned to northern folklore, but were to become well-known parts of popular culture throughout the world. Indeed, according to Sting's autobiography, the final song Last Exit performed in Newcastle was entitled Don't Give Up on Your Daytime Job, an irony that would have resonated with the band profoundly at this pivotal point in their respective careers. Sting's time in Newcastle, in particular with Last Exit, marked a musical apprenticeship that heralded the beginnings of numerous songs that were to eventually become well known through both the Police and his later solo career. The region had also provided his first experiences of a recording studio, Impulse Studios near his birthplace in Wallsend. Recording studio spaces, although in increasingly more luxurious conditions, would in the years to come facilitate the permanent documentation of his political convictions, personal anxieties and snapshots of life, not to mention the exorcism of some of his more painful memories. Although the band members of Last Exit intended to follow him to Newcastle, the security of well-paid, although not particularly glamorous regular work, in addition to family commitments, was to eventually result in the band splitting up, opening up the way for Sting to begin the London stage of his career. So, having served his apprenticeships in the pubs and clubs of northeast England, such as the Gosforth Hotel, Sting arrived in London, signed up for unemployment benefit, and started another season of paying his musical dues, a process which included sleeping on friends' floors, rented apartments, low-paid gigs, and what he describes as flea pit hotels. All of these factors would eventually influence his creative output. After initially being introduced to Stuart Copeland by journalist Phil Sutcliffe in Newcastle after a Curved Air gig, Sting made a point of re-engaging with the American soon after moving to London, at the drummer's then residence, the top floor of 26 Green Street in Mayfair, which had been appropriated as a squat with other members of Curved Air, including Copeland's eventual wife, Sonia Christina. Describing him as the most exciting drummer I've ever worked with. Sting and Copeland's informal jam sessions at this address represents the beginnings of a musical partnership that would ultimately change both of their lives. I don't have time to discuss how Sting was to progress from signing on the dole in London to international stardom only a few years later. But what is apparent is that increased wealth and social status began to impact his personality, in particular his Geordie identity. In a 1983 interview for Rolling Stone, Sting reflected on the impacts of stardom on his personal characteristics when he stated, and I quote, "I'm quite interested in finding me again. I used to be the same sort of person on stage that I was in private life, but now it's sort of a monster. He looks wonderful with the lights and the crowds, but in the kitchen, it's a bit much. I'm just trying to find out who is the real me. Is it this monster or someone more normal?" End quote. Sting's reference to himself as he in this interview is interesting. As like many successful rock stars before him, he can be considered as having developed a complex persona, in which he considered there to be a clear difference between local boy Gordon Sumner and the rock star the world knows as Sting. According to one of his biographers, Christopher Sanford, both his wife and son were asked to call him by his stage name as early as 1980, something which can be verified in his autobiographical movie Bring on the Night, where he was clearly offended when a journalist called him Gordon during a press conference. He asked, "Who is this Gordon Sumner character?" When commenting on his personality in the early 80s, the 31-year-old Sting described the dual nature of his character when stating, and I quote, "I'm sort of two people, and I do have a dark side." End quote. So, considering his creative output from a psychoanalytical perspective, the complexities of Sting's character should theoretically be visible in his music, something which he confirmed, and I quote, he stated, "My personal life is in my songs. Many of them seem quite contradictory, and I seem to be two people. On the one hand, a morose doom-laden character, and on the other, a happy-go-lucky maniac. I'm as ambiguous as Martin, the character I played in Brimstone and Treacle. And I didn't have to delve too deeply into myself to excavate him. He's definitely an exaggerated version of me." A section of Sting's iPad application, 25 Years, discusses how as a songwriter he enjoys the notion of having dark subject matter juxtapositioned against jolly music. As an indicative example, it's apparent that this philosophy is pervasive from the Police's first album, with songs such as Next to You, Be My Girl, the chorus of So Lonely, and I Can't Stand Losing You, through to later songs such as All This Time, clearly realising this split personality objective. This leads to the question, how can we use Sting's music to better understand his creativity and personality, in particular his relationship to his background and hometown? As opposed to solely attempting to get to know the actual singer of a piece of music, it's useful to consider the broader persona of an artist, as these factors are often distinct and interrelated. Philip Oslander distinguishes between the real person, the performance persona, and what he describes as the character, labels which musicologist Alan Moore refines more to musical analysis in terms of performer, persona, and protagonist. This in turn leads to a number of important considerations, such as, is there a relationship between the performer and persona? If so, what is it? Is the protagonist, or the character of the song, based on real or imagined characters in the singer's life? If there is more than one protagonist, how and why do they interact with one another? How does the background texture of a piece of music relate to and expose the characteristics of the persona? These often complex artist, environmental, persona relationships have consequential impacts on the listener, which Alan Moore also considers to be a tripartite paradigm, which I paraphrase as follows. The passive observer, which largely speaks for itself. It's basically when someone listens to the song, but they have no direct relationship with it. The second characteristic, the possessed protagonist, is more interesting. This is where the listener can directly relate to the character or the protagonist of a song. In actual fact, they can become the protagonist. And finally, the third category is the antagonist, where the listener can directly relate to the person being addressed in the song. So, if we look at the diagram here, we can clearly see what I've just talked about in the top three rectangles. And if we look below, we can also see the passive observer, the possessed protagonist, and also the antagonist. And down the right hand side there, we can see the distance that the singer is from the audience is also very important. And that can range from the intimate, where you've got a really breathy voice that appears to be very close up in the mix, and perhaps the background music is actually very low in the mix behind the vocals, through the personal, through the social, to something much more public, where the singer can be heard to be addressing a much bigger audience. And we will discuss this in a bit more detail as we move on. So, as an indicative example of how these processes reflect Sting's northern identity, a song such as Dead Man's Boots from The Last Ship can be seen to include a number of protagonists, all of which are arguably related to Sting's past. The song commences with a father speaking to his son, Gideon. He speaks to him directly in the first person. However, although this dialogue is on one level simply characters in the script of The Last Ship, it can also be considered autobiographical, with the father easily being read as addressing the young Gordon Sumner, who apparently suffered very similar tensions. I'm now just going to play a brief sample of the song Dead Man's Boots. This parallel dialogue referred to earlier can therefore be considered as either fictional, where the father-to-son dialogue can be seen to be between two protagonists, or autobiographical, where the interchange is an allegory of a conversation between two actual people, Sting and his father. The father-to-son perspective continues into the first chorus of the song, where the advice the father is giving continues. Interestingly, the second verse progresses from what is thus far a private conversation between father and son to a narrative which is more social in nature, in which the performer or persona, be it Gordon Sumner or his alter ego Sting, or indeed the fictional protagonist, the son Gideon, is now telling an audience, i.e. the listener, the story. This shift in emphasis has the impact of including the listener in the narrative more profoundly, as either a passive observer, or, if our connection with the personas are more profound, as a possessed protagonist. In this case, leading to we as listeners actually becoming the father and or the son. This is something which has impacted me personally. Having a similar social background and northeastern heritage to Sting, it's easy for me to identify with either the son as myself, or indeed the father in my relationship with my own children. After the second chorus is repeated, the narrative then shifts to a bridge section, once again delivered by the son, who this time asks the audience, "Why the hell would I do that? Why would I agree?" As this statement is asking at least a rhetorical question, it can once again be considered a development of the social nature of the dialogue, although once again it can be viewed as a statement from Gideon, the character in the song, Gordon Sumner, Sting, or indeed ourselves, depending on how one interprets. In addition to the perspectives outlined here, this voicing of the son's relationship with his father could be considered from what George Lopez describes as strategic anti-essentialism, where an artist, and I quote, takes on disguises in order to express indirectly parts of their identity that might be too threatening to express directly, end quote. In Sting's case, is he engaging with the often complex relationship with his father, but via the protection of another person? Is it this that enables Gideon to comfortably say to his father at the end of the song, and I quote, "I want nothing from you. I want nothing at all. Get this through your head. I'm nothing like you. I'm done with all the arguments. There will be no more disputes." End quote. Is it easy? Because technically it's not Sting speaking. A fascinating aspect of The Last Ship is that it is largely delivered in a Geordie accent. The accent that the young Gordon Sumner would have spoken in, but deliberately disguised during his years in the public eye. A recent review in The Guardian considered Sting's Geordie accent in The Last Ship to be, and I quote, "a reasonable attempt at method acting," end quote. A statement which adds further depth to these issues that have been discussed. Although he could be regarded as taking on the persona of a northeastern working class male of the 1980s for this part, it's proposed that Sting is addressing an aspect of his being that is more than simply acting, as it directly engages with his alter ego, Gordon Sumner. When promoting the album with Sting, his friend Jimmy Nail refers to hearing Gordon singing, in his own dialect at times, with Sting responding by discussing how his funny voice comes out when he's angry or drunk. Maybe it could be argued that it comes out when he's actually being himself. So in conclusion, it's apparent that Sting's relationship with Newcastle has had a significant impact on his creative output, and it's possible to broadly consider the years 1977 to 1985 in terms of outward momentum, while the last 20 years has witnessed an increasing gravitational pull, during which his interface with the city has become far more profound. In a 1981 interview for the Sunday Times, Sting commented on his escape from his Northern England identity when he stated, quote, "I don't make a big thing out of being a Geordie. I've lost my accent deliberately. We weren't a particularly happy family. It was the sort of family you inevitably go away from." End quote. When conducting an interview for Time Out magazine the following year in Newcastle to film Stormy Monday, Chris Sallowers asserted that in his natural habitat one sees Sting in a new light. Suddenly, his features appear extraordinarily Scandinavian. When Sallowers commented upon the unmistakable lilt of his accent returning, Sting responded, I quote, "My accent is a consequence of having watched newscasters on TV and seeing where the real power in this country is. I think you do it as a strategy. My accent placed me exactly where I came from, in a terraced house on the dockside, and it wasn't to my advantage to let people know that at the time." End quote. When discussing the opportunities attending grammar school offered him, Sting continued, and I quote, "I started to visit kids from around here, so I made a decision. If that world was attractive to me, I wanted to be able to have it. I think it's always ruled my life, not materialism necessarily, but the ability to make choices. Up until then, I had no choices. You either worked down the pit, or you worked in the shipyard, or you were on the dole. So education, doing well at school, being an athlete, changing my accent, will always have given me that option to leave Newcastle if I wanted to." End quote. Sting's ongoing interface with Newcastle can be seen to operate on a number of levels, ranging from simply visiting the area, either privately or when on tour, to special performances, to lyrical content on subject matters such as the shipyards and his parents in particular. It also includes the use of northern musical signifiers, such as the Northumbrian pipes, which have been used on numerous recordings, and of course the strategic return of his Geordie accent, which was particularly apparent on albums such as If in a Winter's Night, its associated DVD, A Winter's Night Live from Durham Cathedral, in addition to The Last Ship, in which, as we've seen, Sting re-engages with a number of themes explored in earlier work, be it his complex relationship with his parents, his working class background, the sea, or the proximity of Swan Hunter shipyards. In fact, you can see the image that we're looking at now. This image seems to be so important to Sting, as it was a visual landscape that he grew up with. And it's such an unusual sight, seeing such a huge ship at the end of a row of terraced houses. And this image is iconic in the Northeast, and it's obviously ingrained itself really profoundly on Sting. And all of these things arguably are beginning to accumulate in Sting eventually coming to terms with his northernness. As noted by Hogsbourne and Ranger, tradition is often invented to compensate for factors of identity that have been taken away. And this ideology is arguably operating throughout this album and its forthcoming Broadway musical, where Sting is attempting to recapture an ideological perspective of the working class infrastructures of his childhood in the northeast of England. This is the first stage of a forthcoming book, which intends to frame Sting's creative output against the real, imagined and idealised places and spaces that he's occupied through time, including many places outside of Newcastle. It will also analyse how the social and cultural conditions surrounding his upbringing in Newcastle have impacted his music, and how the narratives of his creative activity have developed as he experienced the world.